Alright guys, Murphs here, and today I want to talk about the 223 Remington slash 5.56 by 45mm NATO cartridge. Now, longtime subscribers of the channel will note that I have done multiple different videos on things involving the 5.56 cartridge. However, I've never necessarily done a full-on video on the cartridge itself in kind of the same way that I've done with a couple of other cartridges, where we talk about the history, some of its performance dynamics, places where it performs really well, places where it doesn't, and then compare it to something else as well. Haven't really done that with the 5.56. We talked a lot about different aspects of it, and there's a lot of things to cover with this cartridge, many more that are not necessarily in the scope of this video that we're going to cover today. And I thought, maybe we should go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into it. So, with that being the case, I do want to go ahead and identify a little caveat real quick. I'm going to refer to the 223 Remington and the 5.56mm as kind of interchangeable in this case. I'm going to kind of flow through them. I will at some point identify where they're kind of different, but I've done an entire video covering the difference between those cartridges. So if that's something that you're interested in, I'll put the link in the description, but it's a pretty self-explanatory concept overall. Now, let's go ahead and get into a little bit of history. Now, in the 1950s, a young designer was trying to get the United States military to become more serious about a lightweight fighting rifle system. He initially would attempt with what is now referred to as the AR-10, which would be summarily rejected because it wasn't what the United States Army was looking for at the time. Now, he would wind up shifting his efforts from going after a .308 battle rifle into something more in an intermediate type cartridge capacity at that point. Now, I find it very interesting that at this time the United States military was not seriously considering intermediate cartridges, and that seems like a huge flaw in my own opinion. Now, perhaps this is because we have the benefit of hindsight now, looking back on the fact that intermediate cartridges have some pretty fantastic advantages over full power rifle cartridges or pistol type cartridges. But it's odd to me that it took this long for anybody to get serious about the process in the West. Now, the Eastern Bloc was already fielding the AK-47 and the 7.62 by 39mm cartridge, so they hopped on intermediate cartridges relatively quickly. And I don't necessarily want to get into a full-on history of intermediate cartridge other than to identify right now that I think it has a little bit to do with exposure to the intermediate cartridge. The Germans developed the STG-44 and the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz cartridge during World War II, and I think it mostly saw fielding on the Eastern Front. There was very little use of it on the Western Front, which meant that Western forces didn't really get an appreciation for what the cartridge brought to the table. And even the Soviets would initially consider the 7.62 by 39 chambered AK-47 to actually be analogous to a submachine gun, which is kind of a terrible use of an intermediate cartridge, but it would quickly rectify that in their own doctrine. Now, the United States military also attempted to go ahead and standardize a replacement for the submachine gun by throwing full automatic capability into the M14, also allowing it to be used as a kind of BAR squad automatic weapon type function, as well as having the semi-automatic capability of being the rifleman's weapon. And of course, a full auto .308 is not an effective replacement of a submachine gun. There's just certain things that a smaller, lighter platform with a smaller, lighter cartridge are going to do better than that in this case. And the United States military very quickly began to recognize that it actually had a bit of a capabilities gap that it thought it had effectively addressed, which would finally make Eugene Stoner, the M16 rifle, and the 5.56mm cartridge viable. Now, I would have loved to have been in the meeting where Eugene Stoner unveiled this rifle and cartridge combination, because you're talking about a military that is hell-bent on wood and steel rifles and major rifle calibers starting in 30 cal, and then some dude walks in with a souped-up 22 and says, "This is what I want to give you." I can just imagine just the incredulity in their faces that someone would suggest this. Now, what is it? How do we get to this cartridge? How does the 223 Remington come about? Well, really, it's an adaptation of the 222 Remington. Note that the numbers are subtly different in this case. And the original cartridge would be a necked rimless cartridge casing measuring 45 millimeters in length with a 5.56 or 223 caliber projectile and a 55 grain weight. Spitzer type bullet, of course, moving at about 3,200 feet per second out of a 20-inch barrel. Now, hypervelocity, this has some very subtle nuances that make this a really excellent cartridge overall. We'll talk about that more when we get into the data-driven portion of this video. And this is what we would primarily use in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Now, if you're looking for performance aspects of the M16 and all that kind of stuff during Vietnam, we're primarily talking about the cartridge. We're not really going to talk about a lot of the controversy around the early M16 fielding. If you want that information, I suggest you go over to Small Arms Solutions channel. Mr. Bartoccis does an excellent, very in-depth discussion about the early fielding in the M16, and it's very long and kind of dry content, but this man, I'm pretty sure, has more knowledge in his pocket length than I do in my entire body when it comes to this subject. So you guys should totally check that out if that's something that interests you. If I think about it, I'll throw the link in the description for that as well, because it is really interesting stuff. Now, there would be some early issues with the cartridge, and that was a change in propellant. Now, initially, the 5.56 cartridge was developed with stick-type propellant, which has a completely different burn profile than other types of propellant. And the United States military decided that since they had large stockpiles of ball-type propellant left over from World War II at this point, you know, they've been stockpiling it for years. That's what they've been loading in the M1 Garand ammunition, as well as the 308 cartridge for the M14. Why would they switch? Why wouldn't they just go ahead and change things up and run that powder load out of the 5.56 cartridge? What could possibly go wrong with that? And the answer is a lot, because it turns out that if you change the profile or type of the propellant that you're using, it has a pretty drastic effect on how the round performs, and the pressures and velocities that were being reached were causing the bolt to outrun the magazines, lots of malfunctions, all that kind of stuff. It was kind of a big deal. Now, this would be the M193 ball cartridge that was initially adopted in the 55 grain loading. By the 80s, with the adoption of the M16A2, the military decided that it wanted to go to something that had better barrier penetration defeating capabilities. The 55 grain bullet was a copper jacket around a lead core. This is not designed for penetration, and it is unreasonable to expect it to perform well in penetration type tests on like hard barriers and all that kind of stuff. Worked just fine in soft tissue, but once it came up against barriers, it really stopped effectively penetrating steel at under 100 meters. Now, the M855 cartridge would come along. And this would be a 62 grain projectile with the SS109 bullet construction. Now, this would be a steel penetrator in the nose and would be a little bit longer projectile than what you commonly see with the 55 grain bullet. Now, something that's very important to point out is that green tip 62 grain M855 ammunition is not all made the same. There are quite a few manufacturers out there who are making 62 grain bullets that are not SS109 penetrators. So make sure you're kind of staying on top of what it is that you're getting if you think you're getting M855 ammunition. Just throw that out there. Now, this cartridge will be moving at 3,000 feet per second and would be able to penetrate 3/8 inch steel plate at 160 meters. All right, well, that's a better characteristic. This paired with the 1-in-7 twist would move forward in the heavier barreled M16A2 and would continue to serve until the more recent adoption of the M855A1 62 grain bullet, which has a redesign to the penetrator and is supposed to give effective penetration on 3/8 inch steel plate out to 400 meters, while maintaining the same ballistic trajectory and all that kind of stuff of the M855 cartridge. Now, this is not necessarily going to be a video on the M855A1, but we are going to talk about a couple of performance dynamics with it. Very, very lightly touch on it. Again, Mr. Bartoccis has an excellent video on the M855 and an article as well. If you're interested in that, you guys should totally check that out. Now, We've also glossed over the Mark 262 77 grain Black Hills open tip match ammunition. Now this was a cartridge that started getting used in conjunction with the Mark 12 and eventually the Mark 18 rifle systems. It's very interesting because we're talking about two very different applications. One, a designated marksman's rifle meant to fill in the gap from 300 to 600 meters, and the other, the Mark 18, a 10.3 inch close quarters rifle. And we will talk about why the 77 grain got developed for those once we get into the more data-driven aspect of this. So now we've kind of introduced our players overall in the history and development dynamics of the 5.56. Let's go ahead and start talking about a lot of the performance-driven data aspects of this that I've been alluding to this whole time. Now, out of a 20-inch barrel, the 55 grain projectile is moving at 3,200 feet per second. The 62 grain projectile is moving at about 3,000 feet per second. And the 77 grain projectile is moving at 27-ish 100 feet per second. You kind of see how that variance occurs there. Now, hypervelocity rounds and all this kind of stuff create their capability by having that high velocity, which allows them to be able to impart more energy and create that temporary wound cavity. And the idea being is that you have all this energy being delivered once impact occurs, and it's going to send the shock wave through the rest of the body. It's going to have a major impact on a lot of the like air and fluid filled portions of the human body, compression, all that kind of stuff. And it's going to just be an absolute meat tenderizer upon impact, as well as the actual very real aspect of the damage that the bullet occurs. Now the 5.56 has a very interesting relationship in this dynamic because it has a tendency to yaw. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that the bullet, once it enters, it destabilizes and it begins to turn sideways and all that kind of stuff. Now, with it still carrying a lot of energy and a lot of velocity, when it starts to get sideways, that causes the bullet to start to come from together. And you get this fragmenting type process that occurs, that it creates additional wound channels, expands the overall damage that's being occurred, makes it a more lethal overall cartridge. And this actually touched off a bit of a debate during Vietnam, at least, that it was a exploding bullet, that it was in some way causing unnecessary damage along the same lines of dum-dums or hollow points, which had been banned by the Geneva Convention. However, an investigation was launched and it was found that this was not true, that the cartridge was not, yes, by design it's supposed to yaw, but it still doesn't necessarily make it a hollow point as much as it allows it to have a greater overall wounding effect, which was considered to be acceptable for its uses. It's still an FMJ at the end of the day, or a penetrating round at the end of the day. And this also happens to have this thing that causes it to not want to be stable. Now, over the years, I've heard a lot of different opinions about how the 5.56 round conducts its damage inside the body. A lot of people like to take it along the 22 aspect of things, where it'll come in your foot and exit out your head or something along those lines. And there is a certain amount of projectiles have a tendency to stick very close to I guess you could say hard objects. So like hallways and walls and all that kind of stuff. Bullets have a tendency to skim those. And if you get shot in the leg, there is a very real possibility that it could travel up your bone and exit out like your knee or something along those lines. But it's not going to bounce around your body all crazy. It's going to go in a pretty generally straight line. And there's a couple of things that impact that generally straight line that's going on there. Now that yaw type aspect is a thing, but you need a certain amount of velocity to be able to achieve that dynamic. And that barrier occurs at between 25 and 2,700 feet per second. And if you look at this chart that I put together here, you'll see, comes off of gundatacollector.org. That's what I've been using for these. I really like that website. It makes it very easy to kind of represent these dynamics to you guys. You can see that this trade-off between the 55 grain and the 62 grain occurs for the 62 grain between 150 and 200 meters, and the 55 grain between 200 and 250 meters is where we start to lose that effect. And that's one of the issues with a small, lightweight, high velocity round, is it does have a tendency to shed velocity rather rapidly. Now you'll note that I left out the 77 grain OTM in this discussion, and that is because there are certain dynamics that are going to impact that possibility of the round tumbling and all that kind of stuff, and that's going to be what type of bullet you're using. If we're talking about FMJs, that 25 to 27 is a pretty hard line. But if you're talking about open tip match rounds or hollow points, soft tips, and ballistic tips and all that kind of stuff, that's going to change. Those bullets are designed, well, the open tip match is not necessarily designed to come apart, but it could come apart because of its design, whereas the rest of those are absolutely meant to come from together in one form or another. So their velocity threshold is going to be different, and it's kind of a lot to cover. I didn't spend a lot of time trying to track that down. So that's kind of how that energy prospect works. Now, guys, I realized that I didn't necessarily put in, I forgot it again, as usual, to include anything that kind of shows you the difference, what it is that I'm talking about, in case you guys aren't familiar with the 5.56 round. So I'll go ahead and roll in a picture now, since I'm thinking about it. On the left is 7.62 by 3.9. In the middle is the 5.56. And on the right is the 300 blackout. All right, guys, so those are kind of the performance diameters. And when you talk about the 77 grain OTM, something else that's very interesting to me is that it has a very different energy retention to it that you don't necessarily find in the 55 and 62 grain bullets. And formerly, I knew a lot of people who would talk about 77 grainers as though they were like this just completely different classification of weapon for the 5.56. It's like you went from a pea shooter to something that's like actually super viable. And I didn't necessarily agree with that, because ultimately we're still talking about a souped up 22. However, in doing research actually for the 5.56 versus 308 video, which I'll throw a link in the description of that, I did come across something that I found kind of interesting, and that was that there really is a significant increase in energy retention between the 77 grain and the 55 grain, or the 62. And I guess that kind of makes sense, because we are talking about an almost 50% increase in overall mass, which, a 50% increase for anything is significant. You're talking about almost, half again, whatever it is that the capability was previously. And you can kind of see that reflected in the energy. If you look at this chart here, you'll see out at 500 yards, the 77 grain OTM is still retaining about 500 foot-pounds of energy, versus, which is like a 357 Magnum at that point. Very, very comparable to that, versus stuff that's kind of like a really hot 38 in the 55 and 62 grain bullets. So just something to kind of think about there when we talk about this overall increase, is that it actually is fairly significant. Now, that does not make the 77 grain a 5.56 357 Magnum. There's a lot of different dynamics that are going to affect that. However, it does indicate that at longer range, it's going to perform better. And when I diminish the velocity in, say, a 10.3 inch barreled Mark 18, I'm going to have more mass to work with. The 5.56 round primarily is supposed to work off of velocity. If I diminish its velocity, I have to give it some other advantage. So it now makes sense why the Mark 18 is used frequently with the Mark 2.62 load with that 77 grain OTM. Now it makes sense why someone would pursue that, because we still have a great energy trade-off at that point. Even if it gets out to the greatest distance that it could go, and it's at theoretically its lowest velocity for what what we would commonly expect it to do. We take that same dynamic, shrink it down to a 10.3 inch barrel. It's of course going to diminish the distance in which it's going to be able to achieve those velocities, but it's still carrying more energy than if I try to run a 55 or 62 grain bullet out of that rifle. That's kind of cool. All right, guys, now let's talk about some comparison aspects. And let's go ahead and compare the 5.56 to the 5.45 by 3.9. Now, the 5.45 by 3.9 was actually developed by the Soviets as a direct response to the 5.56 NATO and encountering it in Vietnam. And velocities-wise, unfortunately, guys, I really couldn't track down a chart for you, but velocities-wise, it's fairly comparable to the 62 grain M855 cartridge. And the cartridge overall would be more successful had the Soviet Union stuck around longer. It didn't get adopted until 1975. It took quite a few years for other people in the Warsaw Pact to decide that they kind of wanted to go ahead and get online with the 5.45. Most would retain the 7.62 by 3.9. And by the time anyone else started adopting the 5.45, it was about the same time that the wall came down, and then the Soviet Union kind of broke apart, and then all of them ditched the 5.45 and either went to 7.62 by 3.9 again or started adopting 5.56 rifles. So that kind of made it difficult for the 5.45 to make much of a name for itself. Now, From a yaw type aspect, the 545 has an interesting little leg up on the 556 because its tip is actually hollow and not like there's a hole drilled into it, as much as the nose of the projectile, that cavity there, is not filled, which gives it a very different dynamic with how it comes from together in the yaw type aspect of things upon impact. Now, stateside, in the United States, the 545 is not terribly popular, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are not a lot of rifles and there's not a lot of ammunition available. Now, in my area, I found a significant amount of ammunition, but there's another ammunition problem you have to take into account with the 545. Military 545, the old Soviet 7 and 6 loading, has been banned, straight up banned. So whatever's floating around out there is whatever's ever going to float around in the United States. That stuff's not coming in. However, Tula and Red Army Standard have been bringing in 545 ammunition. The problem with those two manufacturers is they're kind of bottom tier ammunition manufacturers. Now, that's not to say that the ammo's not good. It's not to say that it's not going to consistently go bang. The issue becomes that the quality control in velocities, there's quite a variance, which makes it more difficult to be able to have consistent hits at greater distances, repeatable accuracy with the rifle, depending on what it is that you're trying to use it for. 100 yards, you might not notice it. Try to take it up to 500, you might really notice it. So that's kind of how that dynamic comes across there. And it's really unfortunate because there's not a whole lot. It's not like there's a bunch of casings around that you can load your own and then be able to tune that in to make that rifle perform better for you. So it kind of hasn't really caught on. I would like to get into the 545 cartridge. I think it would be really fun to kind of run it up against a 7.62x39 and a 5.56 and kind of see how the performance aspect of it goes. But overall, I would say that the 5.56 has a lot more going for it in overall use, be it either militarily or also in civilian type use. Way more cartridges. You can get whatever flavor or load it is that you want for the 5.56. There's a wide variety of options out on the market, not so much for the 5.45. Now, what are really good uses for the 5.56 223 cartridge? Well, kind of depends on what you're doing. So for a hunting type aspect, I think the 223 and the 5.56 are excellent varmint cartridges. Most or a lot of places do not allow you to use those cartridges on deer. The state that I live in now allows you to use any centerfire rifle cartridge, so in theory you would be able to get away with it. I would not recommend it. If you did it, I would implore you to keep the shots very close so that you actually put ethical hits on the animal. Defensive use, 5.56 is excellent. Depending on what load it is that you pick, you have an interesting dynamic with overpenetration to where, especially with like the old 55 grain FMJ stuff, not as likely to go through barriers, might make it a better overall home defense option for you. And then of course it having a fairly light recoiling profile, it's small ammunition that you can fit a lot, you can carry a lot of it and all that kind of stuff. It really makes it an absolutely fantastic fighting cartridge. However, it's not necessarily, that barrier penetration aspect of it is also what makes it not so great against things like body armor, which the United States military is trying to figure out a workaround for right now. That was supposed to be M855A1's purpose. However, it's not working out as well as they hoped. So, all things, you take the good with the bad. But, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on the 5.56 cartridge. So, I hope you guys found this informative and have a good day.